Welcome to The Street Porter and the Philosopher. I'm the philosopher Rebecca Lowe.
And I'm Henry Oliver.
The Street Porter and the Philosopher is part of our Substack project, The Pursuit of Liberalism, which is dedicated to refocusing classical liberalism on the arts and philosophy alongside economics.
This is our first podcast season, and it's all about liberalism and the arts. We're covering everything from paintings to novels, the reading crisis, to the future and even the idea of liberal culture.
We've applied a division of labour, under which we each speak with some fantastic guests.
We've got academics, writers, an editor, even a bureaucrat. And at the end, Rebecca and I are going to do a review episode.
For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links to the references mentioned, you can click on the link in the show notes or description. And don't forget to visit pursuitofliberalism.com.
I am here with Sunil Iyer, who directs the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. And this means that he can tell us all about how many people are really reading books. Sunil, hello.
Great to meet you again.
So, you're a poet.
Yes.
You've published an anthology of narrative verse, and you direct the Office of Research and Analysis. So you're familiar with the literary and literacy scene in a number of different ways. Give us your overall impression of reading in America.
Well, thanks. So just to be clear, I'll speak here on behalf of my role from the NEA's perspective, from the National Endowment for the Arts, because in that capacity, I get to direct the Office of Research and Analysis. And what we do there is we try to mine data and understand what statistics, among other sources, can tell us about arts and culture and society. And so, of course, reading is a huge part of what we do, understanding reading. And so when you ask that question, I might answer it differently from my pastime perspective. But in terms of the arts and the NEA's role, my role at the NEA, I will say through surveys we've done, even before I came to the NEA, 1982, in fact, the first survey, major national representative survey of reading occurred and was directed by the U.S. Census Bureau with the NEA. And so we've been doing that survey periodically for many, many years, really trying to understand how Americans participate in the arts so we can serve them better through our programs. But in fact, reading, I will say the reading numbers have really commanded a lot of public attention, as you suggest. So right now, I will just share. You want me to share So right back then, when we did the 1982 numbers, it was about 60% of all adults who read a book of any type, not required for work or school. So you could call it leisure reading. And in 2022, our most recent survey, we've actually found that number's now at about 49%, so just under half. But when you look into people reading imaginative literature, so poetry, plays, novels, short stories, a lot of the stuff you like, of course, we find that those numbers are even lower. And in fact, the drop has been steeper. There's been basically a 30% decline in the rate of adults reading those
30
works.
percentage point or 30%?
30% decline. So in fact, now it's about 40% of adults who read any form of literature. That's poetry, plays, short stories, or novels. And that's, again, a 30% decline from back in 1982.
And is this the same as some of the other arts, or is reading seeing a bigger decrease?
Actually, I would say over time, there's a couple things. One is just by sheer percentages, the sheer percentage of people who read anything in the U.S. is much higher than some of the different art forms we ask about. So, in other words, you could say that as an art form, as a way of participating in the arts, reading still commands a very high percentage of adults relative to other art forms. That said, when in terms of the declines, yes, I think they've been, not only have they been sharper, but they've actually occurred more persistently, I think, in both the share of adults who read literature and the share of adults who read books of any type. But I wanted to focus on the literature part because that's where we see this decline being the steepest right now. And I will share that, you could say this in terms of, I just said in terms of literature specifically, but if you look at book reading, novels and short stories, that's particularly what's, I think, driven down those numbers. So it's like 40%, I think, of adults who are reading any form of literature right now. Books.
I shared a survey number online the other day saying that, I don't remember the exact number, but quite a lot of Gen Z young women are reading. And I just shared the stat, no commentary. And I was flooded with people saying, yeah, but they're reading pornographic trash. It's all romantasy. It's all this, it's not real books. Now, I don't really think that. I don't have a problem with that, right? Reading is good. Reading is reading. Whatever. But is that true? Is there you're saying there's some big shift that the readers who are left tend to be reading that kind of thing, and it's less.
We don't know anything about the type of. We don't know the details of the type of literature they're reading within, say, fiction or within poetry or these other genres. But what we also have seen through other data is that it seems like the people who are reading are maybe even reading a little more, which is interesting.
Okay.
But the people who, are dropping out and not reading as much, I mean, there's a larger share of those people, the general public.
But the ones who are left, it's more hours of book
We're
time.
sensing, and so that's coming from another data source, which is another federal data source that we've supported a study, which looked into how much time people spent reading. So on average, I think over, again, a very long period, like 20 years or something, it was something like a 3% drop per year in the share of people who reported on a given day reading for fun. And that could have been anything. That could have been, doesn't have to be literature, high literature or whatever you call it.
Magazine, newspaper.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in fact, they found that the people who were reading were still they were reading for a longer period than for those who for their their counterparts 20 years ago. You know what I mean? So people were reading, the few who are reading, or relatively few who are reading, were reading more intensively, it seems to be, at least in terms of time. So that's a somewhat interesting finding because we don't monitor sales of books or books, book buying. But from what you can see from the industry reports, it does seem that unit sales, there may be a difference, for example, between unit sales and total revenue. So a lot of money, coming out, a lot of, publishing industry may be doing really well, but the number of units, we don't know exactly whether that's actually keeping up with the revenue growth and whether that's actually contributing to more people reading or, in fact, the same people reading maybe more books.
More books. So are people reading on paper, digitally? What's the breakdown?
Yeah, so we don't have a great handle on the differences right now, but I can share that when we asked people, when we ask these questions, we're sort of neutral to the platform. So just to be very clear about that. So this is reading of any type, including electronic reading. But one good question kind of related to that is audiobooks.
Right.
So in fact, when we asked whether people were reading audiobooks as well or doing audiobooks and included that in the number, it grows to like 53%. But that's still lower than, say, 55 or, that it was a few years ago, like 5 years ago.
But you're saying if you factor in audiobooks, the decline is smaller.
It's smaller, exactly.
Quite a lot smaller?
At this stage, we don't know because we've only been doing it for 2 survey periods.
Yeah.
But for that one differential, it was just a relatively small decline. So it's possible that if you add that audiobooks, if it continues to grow, and if we count that as a percentage of all readers, then in fact the decline is mitigated quite a bit.
Okay, so actually it could be that reading has declined, or it could be that a certain percentage of readers have just switched to audio and the change is not that big overall.
Right. In fact, we did a report a few years ago, which was precisely about that, called How Do We Read? And it was all about audiobooks versus print books.
Yeah.
And from the limited data we have so far, it does seem that adding audiobooks to reading, if you include that in your definition of reading as a whole, then in fact, it's smaller. It's still a decline from the share who did that 5 years ago, but it's a much smaller share. And so it does suggest, in the out years, it may very well be that audiobooks mitigates the decline much more, and maybe it even puts us on par with, with the trend line for the past for traditional reading.
Now, there's obviously a huge online debate about, do audiobooks count as real reading? Do you have, or have you seen any good data or analysis about, retention rates, comprehension rates? Do they change across print and audio?
I have not heard, that's a great question. I haven't seen anything about print versus audio in terms of how it improves comprehension or learning. I do know, though, that and I think you would agree, like there's certain skills that they're almost different complementary skills that are fostered through those different ways of engaging with literature, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's listening, it's attentiveness with audiobooks, it's imagination to a large degree. With reading, there's clearly, you're dealing with lexical patterns of recognition and different cognitive processes. So I would be surprised if it was equivalent, but clearly I don't know enough to say whether one is superior to the other in terms of overall comprehension. Digital reading is a little different, though. With digital reading, we do have some data, particularly from other studies that have been done internationally, suggesting that digital reading, especially for early readers, it may have a negative effect on overall comprehension. That is to say, if you come in reading through digital reading only, it's not clear that that's really improving your overall comprehension, whereas it is clear with print reading in early stages, especially of learning how to read, childhood development, that it does benefit total reading comprehension.
Is that because of some, weird magical factor of looking at a screen is bad, or is it because you're possibly just likely to be reading, less challenging material?
It's a little of both, actually. The studies I've seen talk about perhaps less challenging words and, vocabulary that's maybe accessed through purely digital means.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be the primary factor. It also seems to be that through digital reading, there's a lot of skipping around. You're often, maybe there's hyperlinks or you're led to another place, the jumping around. And there's a whole theory about shallow processing, the idea that perhaps people cognitively are not imbibing as much when they're reading that way, especially in early stages when their domain knowledge might not be as big as it is later in life. So there's a tendency, at least in some studies, to show that early reading, especially through digital formats where you're jumping around a little more, you're being invited maybe to go to another web page and come back to where you were. That might be great in some settings, maybe for some kinds of informational processing, but not necessarily for reading long text.
So it's a question of developing a different sort of skill, a different type of reading skill.
Yeah, and I think it's not, I think this is truthfully something that needs further research. Like there's not a lot of, it hasn't come in, like the verdict is not all in for purely print all the time. One thing, again, I think it's sort of like what we were talking about with those people who are still reading today. And there are a lot of them, of course, who are reading print and digital, and I think that's what you're going to see, I think, is much more of this complementary function. I think it's essentially that some of the studies I've seen show that if people already have a good grasp of reading in print, then they're much more likely to gravitate to digital and maybe even choose that as their primary reading method. And nothing seems to hold up their comprehension in that regard. Mm-hmm. But it's more people who go straight to digital without having had that print experience.
If you start with digital aged sort of 5 to 10, you end up as a very different sort of reader than if you are a print-based reading learner and switch in your teens.
And even the way we assess comprehension, maybe that's going to change in the future because, this is the very things that we think valuable retaining may change depending on, what the formats are and what the types of texts are.
Yeah.
But right now it does seem, at least from the studies I was looking at, and there are largely international studies like meta-analyses of like hundreds of thousands of people included in these studies, where they've seemed to be consistent on digital reading is at best modest benefits, but for people's comprehension, but at worst a full-on negative effect on particularly in early stages
for the
of
young
reading.
children.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of constant thing in these debates where people are interested in two different things, I think. The first thing is, are people reading novels? What's the state of literature? Like, how are the arts doing? And the second thing is more just to do with literacy, the level of reading skill, comprehension, and the downstream effects of that socially, politically, in the workforce, whatever. It's very hard to keep those two things separate, isn't it? Can you give us some sense of, from all the data you have commissioned and looked at and worked on, are these two things going in a trend together? Or is it that a lot of people like us who like literature are sort of getting very scared about the decline of reading, but in real money, it's not making that much difference in day-to-day society? Or what's the balance here?
Yeah, I think it's very important to keep that in mind because, people who read anyway, and, agencies that promote reading, are doing it because they know it's intrinsically valuable. But when you do talk about the why for people who have no interest or idea of why this is something important, you do have to tie it to measurable outcomes. And so, there are data showing, and we've produced some of it, showing that in fact readers tend to be more civically engaged, more socially engaged, and this is and they tend to read better too. I mean, so there's a bidirectionality here, of course, because people who read well to begin with are going to gravitate, a lot of times to reading and reading more. But it also works the other way, that people who go to reading and want to read get better as readers. So it is reciprocal. But in terms of other instrumental kinds of outcomes, we know that readers are, like I said, more likely to be engaged in their communities than people who don't read. A lot of this is also overlapped with the variable of education, though. So, what kind of education they had, there's all kinds of sociodemographic variables in this. But when we've controlled for some of that, it still seems that reading is very positively associated with some of those kinds of civic benefits of volunteering, taking part in school, community events, and in school settings. We've seen that with out-of-school activities correlated with things like that. I do think, though, that just knowing how to read and the literacy component is obviously etched into our, the way we're supposed to conduct a democracy and the way we're supposed to, civic life and being being a member of the democracy and contributing in all other ways. So there's a very I think it's very much tied with the health of the nation in a lot of very ways that are writ large, even if sometimes we have to kind of keep pointing to those connections through research.
There is one thesis that goes around, is that as people read less, or as fewer people read, people generally get worse at media literacy, at being able to evaluate the truth of claims, and this leads to the general instability and craziness of the world that is being experienced in multiple ways. There doesn't, to me, seem to be much positive evidence to link these two things. It seems to be a sort of, these two things are happening, therefore. Do you know of any such evidence? Do you have any
linking the people's failure to read with?
So it could just be that, smart, conscientious people will always be more civically engaged, better at evaluating the things that politicians say, better at knowing that this news channel is biased in this way or whatever.
Right.
And that it's not like because they read, it's just a natural function of and that the reading decline is like a graph that gets shared online, but it isn't necessarily
tied to these things.
If reading was going up 3% a year instead of down 3% a year, is it that in 5 years do we have research that really suggests
shows that it has this?
Oh yes, society will be very different. Like that to me seems.
I think you're right to point out that this is all correlational. There's no kind of causal effect. We're not showing that if people do read more, automatically their circumstances are going to improve. It's just that over time, even when you control for other factors, you often see that people who read more and read literature even more tend to be correlated with outcomes that objectively seem better than outcomes for the people who don't, according to certain outcomes. Like if you look at economic factors, outcomes, their own kind of earnings and, civic contributions, things like that. But there's a lot that we're not capturing. And so we can't, it would be too much to say that if the chart's going down, you're automatically going to see everything go, go to hell in a handbasket or whatever. That's not really what we're trying to articulate either. I think it's just, these are indicators of how engaged people are with the active imagination, with, I think there's sometimes the word empathy is overused in this context, but it's the ability to inhabit another perspective or viewpoint or character when you read. And I think those kinds of functions, and even the quietening of the mind to be to have a space where one, is focused and has attention. Those are skill sets, and if you want to call it that, or attributes that I think can easily get eroded. And the other thing I'll just share is, this, I think we might have, Marianne Wolf and researchers who are neuroscientists have talked about reading is not a natural activity. It's a really something that humans do that takes a lot of work cognitively, neurobiologically, and semantically, and it's something that we can't take for granted. And so sometimes you do need some markers or some trend lines to monitor to know whether we're on the right track.
This is that wonderful book, Proust and the Squid.
Yes, right.
So that's largely about children. And I want to go back to that point about children reading on screens, because I looked at some of the studies and the data about this, and it's not clear to me what's really going on. If a child is, let's say they're 8, they're using WhatsApp, they're clicking hyperlinks, they're doing that kind of digital reading. Obviously, that's, probably not sensible after a certain threshold. But if they're given an iPad and they're going to read an encyclopedia article on the iPad, is that really any different to if they're just given, we had the paper encyclopedia?
Yeah, and see, this is where it gets tricky, because when you censure digital reading like that, you're kind of saying that every single category is just useless, or it doesn't have It's
and the research isn't picking apart.
It's not. No, you're right, and it's not quite as nuanced as that.
Yeah.
And a lot of these great meta-analyses, I think, are categorically talking about digital reading. So you don't really, and some of it is only focused on kind of nonfiction information type stuff. So it's really, I'm sure there's subtleties like that, but if you want to kind of paint it with a broad brush, I think it's fair to say that some of the characteristics of digital reading that involve the skipping around, there's been studies of eye tracking movements and how shallow or the skimming patterns that go on with digital reading versus print reading. I think the jury's out on long-term effects on those, but even even anecdotally, or even just understanding some of the research that we've seen, as limited as it is, suggests that people are not engaging as deeply with that particular text. So maybe that's okay with, just an encyclopedia entry or a timetable for a metro, a train or something. But when you're getting into something that maybe is more substantive and the society thinks it deserves greater scrutiny or greater attention, like maybe a newspaper article, or that's about a candidate, or if you're talking literature, something that's a work that's going to move you to a new height of inspiration or understanding. I think those kinds of works probably deserve much more attention, and it's not clear yet that some of the digital formats enable that. Now, I do think ebooks and digital reading, there's nothing to suggest that can't reach the same, that it's not doing as well as print books in terms of comprehension. But I think when you talk about digital reading as a class versus just print reading, I think it's easier to point at potential gaps in digital reading.
So if we want to take, the research we have and make as informed a decision as we can about how children should read, books are good. A Kindle that only has books and doesn't have any other stuff on it, that's basically probably as good. An internet connection that they use for encyclopedias and other things is probably a lot better than social media, WhatsApp, whatever. But it's very hard for us to at that end. It's very hard.
That's very well put. And I think some of those are really good for things. Like, it's possible that I would recommend maybe a kid. I'm not speaking for a policy thing, but I would say it may be that in some cases the encyclopedia online is going to be way better than going and trying to find the book that that bears that particular article in it. It depends on what it's being used for, what kind of information is being retrieved. I think information retrieval is obviously in a different category in a way than reading, not just for information. And again, the surveys we do are about books and also what I'm calling kind of imaginative literature. So literature that's novels, short stories, poems, and plays, where yes, there's a different kind of information in it. Like William Carlos Williams said, you can get the news out of poems. So there is news there, but it's not quite of the same. It's not really information retrieval as we're talking about it.
Do we know what predicts whether someone will become a reader?
Well, I can tell you a few factors that seem to. Shortly, I don't know exactly what the answer is to that, but I know studies have shown that clearly high levels of parental education, social economic affluence doesn't hurt. But I would say clearly access to raw materials. And in fact, even things like the numbers of books in a home, I don't know if they're dwindling now as a society, but that has been highly correlated with reading ability and, in fact, reading ability and propensity to read as well.
Does it matter if there are books in the home versus the child is regularly taken to a library, has a library at school?
I don't know enough to know those differences. I don't know if there's a big difference there.
But access to books.
Having them around or even having the ability to access them, I think is a big piece of all this. I think just, knowing that the one can, turn around and, I don't know if you've ever tried to trick a young, a child or something to read. Part of it is just having a book around, maybe in a place where they wouldn't expect it. I'm not saying that's.
I have lots of tricks. Yes.
Yeah. There are many like that, I'm sure. But that's another thing, is kind of having the proximity to these points of engagement.
Okay. Are libraries more or less important than they used to be?
We actually don't conduct surveys directly with libraries, but we do look at some of the library data. There's a public library survey. And they seem to still be doing really well. I think they're now it's possible that maybe a lot of what's attracting people to libraries are, for a long time was internet access. I don't know if that's the case anymore. Sure. But a lot of that is also in the mix, like engaging with technology in these libraries. But I know that, of course, as we were just talking about, going there and engaging with books and, checking out books, it remains, I hope, a major part of what they do. But I think a lot of libraries are also changing a lot of what their functions are in their communities. They're no longer just repositories of books. They're definitely engaging through, community activities, education, even in a lot of these artistic venues. They've become kind of artistic venues as well. So I think they definitely are very dynamic. And I don't know enough about the finances or where they're headed right now, but I will say that from all the signs I've seen, they're still going strong.
One of the things in some of the historical data I found is that there was an increase in reading literature between 2002 and 2008. It was this sort of funny bump in the graph, and a lot of that was brought about by young people reading more literature. Do we know why that bump happened?
It's a great question, and the questions I would get when that came out is, what was it, the Harry Potter effect and all that kind of stuff? Don't know. I really don't know.
We still don't know.
And it was a really interesting bump, and I will share that when soon after I came in, or soon before I came into the NEA, the chair there, Dana Gioia at the time, had commissioned a report called Reading at Risk, because he basically found that the survey data that I was just describing in 1982, that number I gave, 60, and it slipped to like 57.
Yeah, the graph is quite steep. Yeah.
So that was a pretty sharp decline from 82 and for reading literature, it was like 57% to 47% of adults. So that was like between 1982 and 2002. So he said, let's just do this report. Let's promote the idea, or let's get people to understand this problem, which he saw as a national crisis. And so the NEA, and a lot of teamed up with publishers, bookstores, libraries, and really try to, get ahead of this, and, did things like national book reading campaigns. And the NEA founded something called the Big Read, which still goes on, is very successful. I think it's engaged like 6 million people through its programs, a couple hundred, 2,000 or so programs all around the country. And that was something that started, and there were a lot of such programs around that time between 2002 and 2008 when that study came out. So I'm not saying it's all can be laid at the door of these programs, but I think there was a general attempt. I know there was a wholehearted attempt by a lot of people in the literacy community and in the literature community to try to get more people to read. So I don't say it's attributable to that one thing, but I think it was part of a movement that kind of happened over that brief period.
Now, the other thing that surprised me is that the adult audience for poetry seems to have grown in recent years, or at least remained pretty steady.
Yeah.
And it's gone up a bit more for young people than for adults.
Yeah.
That's quite shocking.
It's interesting. I mean, so from 12%, I think it was 12%, 20 years ago or so, and then it dipped. And then it came back up, not quite to the original level of 12% of adults who read poetry.
But we're between 9 and 12.
Yeah, it's about 9% or so who, the last survey, read any poem in their last year. So something I should tell people is when we ask these questions, we're asking them to think back to the last year, 12 months, and did they do that activity? So did they read a book, or did they? We don't say they have to finish it. Did they read a book at all? Did they read, a novel, short story, play, whatever?
My favorite Samuel Johnson quote is when it's in Life of Boswell and he's talking to someone about how he read this book and he didn't think it was very good and he didn't finish it. And his companion says, "What do you mean you didn't finish it?" And Johnson goes, "Sir, do you read books through?" Appalled that anyone would finish a
Right, exactly. So that's, so poetry reading, it's interesting because at the time, and there were a wave of these news articles that came out when we came out with these findings suggesting it was I don't know if they're still around, the Insta Poets or the Insta Poetry.
Well, my follow-up question is, was it Instagram?
Yeah, and that was a big theory that may have been some of it. No one, I don't know, but I think there were a lot of people at that time who were very happy to see that up. And again, it tells us these aren't irreversible declines, and so that gives some hope, I think, to the fact that, and I think, again, just to say novels and short stories right now, I think I said 38% of adults who read one of those, and that's pretty low. And the thing is, I didn't share this, but when you look at men versus women, it's just a starker decline. It's like 20%. The thing is,
I really want to ask you about that, because the 20% gap has remained the same while the other numbers have gone down. What is that?
So both percentage of men and women are reading much less than they did before in all these forms. However, women are still reading more than men at a higher rate, and that 20 percentage point split.
Yeah.
So that's persisted, and so I guess we should be worried, especially about the men here, because I said it was like 38% of adults who read a novel, short story. It's like more like 28% for men, and so it's really it's going lower and lower, and so it's kind of like this question of, I don't know, is that, one thing I will share with a lot of our arts attendance questions, even for arts participation, you often see women doing a lot more of these activities.
And by participation, you mean going to
largely
a concert?
Attendance. Yeah. Some forms of art creating, we see men actually having a higher rate, but a lot of times it's the women are leading in terms of the sheer number of people going.
Where do men lead in art creation?
I don't know why. Well, that's for certain things. I know that occurred when I was looking at something like music or jazz, particularly.
Okay.
You see some specific forms where
dad's in a band.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then you have, as you mentioned, the Big Read. You also have the Poetry Out Loud scheme.
Yes.
Both of these schemes seem to have done a lot. What is the success? What's the factor?
So I think it comes with, I think there's a real rich community element in all this. So it's not, so the NEA gives grants and through its partners supports these events where it's not just one lone nonprofit organization who's trying to make a difference. They're partnering with others to make something happen. So for Poetry Out Loud, for example, it's schools and it's states, the state arts agencies. Every state has a state arts agency, and they are in turn our partners with this. And so they make sure that it's kind of a pyramid structure of a competition, like a spelling bee or something, for the Poetry Out Loud recitation contest. And so there's a whole infrastructure there that's mobilized with our funding and with our partners. And I think therefore it becomes almost like a competitive event. If you've ever been to a Poetry Out Loud event, I'd highly recommend it if you're in any state in the country. And then the national ones here in DC, there's a cheering section. There's kind of like, people are really excited about hearing a poem being recited, and it's done with such flourish. And so, there's such there's poise, there's things you look for in an arts performance, and and there's some great outcomes for the poetry, the students. Like they often will report afterward how much it made them love reading and love literature, but also feel engaged in their communities and in life. So there's a lot of that. I think this is a spillover benefit of sort of bringing the literature out into the communities and not so much assuming that it's happening all in solitude. Although, of course, a lot of reading is happening in solitude. So there's ways to kind of bring that social element to literature that I think we can uniquely do through arts programming.
And for these two programs, how well do we understand whether the young people involved were already readers or are sort of being brought to become readers or are becoming more serious readers? Do we have a good grip on?
Yeah, with a big read, particularly, we know that all kinds of people get engaged in these programs, from non-readers to readers who don't read that much to people who are really passionate about the book being, because it's usually like they'll choose a book as a community to celebrate and to do arts programming around. And I think with America 250 this year, there's a lot of American literature that's really in the forefront. But I think that that is very variable, and I think again, it's maybe they're coming at it from a there's talking about books. There's maybe book clubs around it. There's social events. So there are people who aren't necessarily in it for the literature, frankly, but are just there to have a good time. And in the process, they kind of rub shoulders with the work, right? Because it's a theme of an event, or it's or maybe there's a speaker who comes to give a little lecture on that book, and they participate sort of in a way that's not quite directly reading the literature. So I think these are other ways that people can get at reading, and then hopefully down the road, and we don't know yet. The follow up is, are they likely now to read if they didn't read before?
But do we know? I think you said 6 million children have done that. The big read,
or not children, people.
Do we know how many of them were low volume readers of any sort before they joined?
We don't know
program?
that from that data.
Okay,
but that's a great question, and in fact, that's something I know that when he established this program years ago, Dana Gioia was really big on understanding this, and we did some surveys at the time to understand the initial years of the big read, whether people were actually changing their reading practices. And what we learned is a lot of people were changing their attitudes toward reading. It wasn't so much, we don't know if they continued reading because we didn't continue with the study, but what we saw was they were much more likely to say they were going to go to a book club, or they were going to go to next time, go to the library even more often, and things like that.
How much do we know about reading habits among people for whom English is a second language?
Oh, great question. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot at the national level. We do have a lot of, as I said, with our survey data, when we break it out, for example, by race and ethnicity, we can see that certain subgroups have much lower rates. Some demographic subgroups have much lower rates than the national level rate that I gave. And some of those may in fact be people whose first language was not English. So
we don't know if they are reading in their first language.
We don't know that. Yeah. I mean, the survey does not specify a language, but of course, you have to, and the Census Bureau has ways of getting at households where the first language isn't English. But I don't think we have enough of a sample to know what the in general, people, that's a great question, people whose first language isn't English, how they're doing, whether they're reading their own literature, whether they're reading English literature, we don't know.
So we don't know, like, if among people for whom Spanish is a first language or, a co-language or whatever, we don't know if they're doing a lot of Spanish reading.
But it's a kind of analysis we could do with these data. And it's very interesting that you asked that. I think it's worth pursuing. Because,
one thing that really stayed with me was when I learned that sales of poetry written in Irish are actually quite a lot more robust. There's a sort of strong community of people who still read that. Which, I don't know, it felt unexpected to me, and I wonder how much
was that in the UK or?
I think it's in Ireland itself.
Oh, in Ireland. Yeah. Well, that's great.
It's very interesting.
That is very interesting, and I think there's a lot of. I'd be very interested as a reader to know a lot more about the subgenres and what kinds of groups are gravitating to what kinds of reading. With these surveys, as you can appreciate, they're an instrument that can sometimes be a blunt instrument because it's really it's a quick survey, and you have to ask it of thousands and thousands of people. Tens of thousands of people are getting these questions, and you only have limited time with them to ask these questions, especially since we work with the Census Bureau, which has its own survey, so we tack onto their survey. And not to bore you, but I'm just saying that there's a lot more questions. If we had the real estate, we would love to ask on the survey.
Well, no, I wanted to get to this because there are a lot of surveys being pushed in the media about the decline of reading, whether they're your data, other people are doing surveys. There's so much of this. There are so many graphs showing, oh my goodness, it's going down. But one thing I'm sort of getting from you in this conversation is that we don't know everything we would need to know, and that we can make some tentative conclusions, but we should be open to the idea that it might, the real picture might not be quite what it looks like.
I think you're right. The only thing I would caution about is I do think there's been, these data, we've been asking the question in some ways the same way for years and years and years.
Do you read a book?
Yeah. Did you read a book of any type? It could have been any kind, et cetera. Now, of course, the ways people read have expanded enormously since, 40 years ago or 30 years ago or 20 years ago. But I think there is something to the trend line. Like there is a marked decline in the general Again, the thing to remind people is it's the general population. So people often say, well, people are still reading. I'm seeing people on the metro reading reading Middlemarch. And I'm like, well, that's great. But where do you live? And what's your zip code? And where's it? I mean, I think you have to talk about like the entire country. And it's a pretty large country. So if you see the rates, eroding over a period of many years and somewhat there was a blip here and there, but it's pretty much a particular direction. I think it's worth, maybe sitting up a little more than say a poll, which is, a snapshot survey and it says that things seem to be fine because 80% of people are reading. I do think there's a lot of nuance, though, that we have to unpack. There's a lot more we'd like to know as researchers, and I think there's a lot the policymakers could know. But I think unidirectional, like there is this pretty, I would say there's a preponderant amount of these data showing that fewer and fewer people are reading works of literature as we broadly define it, and also books in general.
Do we know from time use surveys what they're doing instead?
Well, we know some of the things you would imagine, TV, going online, all those things takes up much more time in an average given day.
And what's the biggest? Because to me, it always seems that TV is the enemy of reading.
It was TV. It was TV. I think last I looked, it was like 2 hours, close to 2 hours.
So it's more like 3 hours, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's like that. I don't know what the latest was, but for reading, it's something like 16 minutes on average. And this is not that everybody's spending 16 minutes. They're taking average figures. Sure, yeah. So 16 minutes a day out of a day, leisure time. I have to stress that. So they could have been reading for work. 16 minutes versus this 3 hours or whatever, 2 or 3 hours for TV. So that's staring you in the face right there. So part of the reason we do these surveys is because we want the public to know also about how, to be aware of how the country is doing on certain indicators, because it's discretionary time. I mean, people have limited leisure time, and different people from different backgrounds have even less leisure time than other people. So it's not an equal attribute. It's scarce. And so we want people to know that, there are things you could be doing with your leisure time, and there's opportunity costs to that. Like reading is probably one of those things that's high on the list of something people could spend more of their time budget doing and maybe reap some rewards.
But this general idea that it's social media and phones that have taken away time from reading, that's not necessarily reflected in the time use surveys. It's more likely to be TV, or it's a bit of both.
I think it's a bit of both. I don't know that the time use survey actually has a clear read on the social media stuff. I'll have to go back and look. That's not our survey, but it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics survey that has that. But it actually does. I wouldn't be surprised if social media is now a bigger share of what they do. I haven't looked at it.
But we don't know if social media is taking away from time that would have been TV. Right?
Yeah, that I don't know right now.
It always seems to me that if you're watching short form videos on Instagram, you would otherwise have been watching Netflix or watching HBO.
That's what I want to go back and look at is when they ask about TV, are they, I can't imagine it's sitting in front of a TV set or that can't be.
No, I think a lot of it's streaming.
Yeah, it's streaming, or it could be in the middle of a social media post, or, it could be very much intermingled with social media activity. So I don't know how they ask that question. It's easily discoverable though, because it's on their website and everything.
So, but the basic sort of takeaway from the research you've done and that you've read is that it's not so much the internet that killed reading as television and radio.
I don't know. I mean, yeah. So you look at the time use survey and you keep seeing this discrepancy of, on the one hand, TV and reading, and maybe social media in there. You might conclude that that's the big bear, right? TV. I don't know. I think the reason I'm hesitating a little is because, again, this is all correlational. But when you look at the co-occurrence of this with the rise of social media, and particularly, some of these declines happening and being accelerated during a period when social media is even more prolific. I guess we just question whether there's any kind of relationship there because so many educators and others have tended to perhaps social media usage or excessive social media usage, especially among the young, eroding certain patterns of cognition. So if that's the case, then we would assume that some of that is bearing out in these reading numbers as well. But I don't have a hard answer for that.
So on this point about patterns of cognition, there was an email posted on Marginal Revolution last year from a teacher, and he said his students are not good at linear reading anymore, which is he gives them Aristotle and they just, they can't just read the book and understand it. But they're much better at finding connections between texts and spotting these patterns across, which he said is maybe because that's what they do online. They constantly move between things. To what extent do you think we're seeing, reading is changing? It's not dying, it's becoming something different.
Yeah, and maybe we're underselling some of the benefits of digital reading. It's just that I think it's important really to have both. And I guess I don't know the context, like if the person, assuming this is higher education, these are probably
I think he's like a high school.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I think that there's clearly benefits to that kind of reading, in knowledge retrieval, again, as we were saying, but also to make new discoveries en route to reading a text. I guess the question remains whether that's going to, if that substitutes for what he's calling linear reading, if the benefits are going to be less weakened. And what are the benefits we're talking about? Retention, attention, the ability to form one's own idea or relationship to the material and true engagement with the text. I don't know if it's being compromised or it's being expanded. I suspect that if people are already enjoy reading, as you said or suggested, that it is sort of circular. If people enjoy reading and they go to reading anyway, then they're probably getting some benefits out of that type of reading. It's just that if that supplants what that person called linear reading, I guess I would be a little concerned.
Do you think there's a problem that children are made to read books in school that they hate and that kills the love of reading?
That could be it. I don't know. I think everything has to be questioned. I don't know that it's texts are not the ones they like or whatever, but I do think, when I was looking at the men and women split, part of that I was wondering, is it that they're not directed to the right things they may like? Maybe the men don't.
Does that split start in childhood?
The split, it does start in childhood. And actually, what I was thinking of just now is just getting back to kids, and this isn't about gender, but I'm just saying that, among 9-year-olds, it turns out like 40% of them now say they'll read for fun every day, almost every day. That's pretty good, but that used to be 53%, 10 years ago. And similarly for 13-year-olds, I think it's like half of the share of people who said they would read for fun every day has gone away. So it used to be 27%, now it's 14%. So I think there's definitely this decline that I've been talking about in adults. The survey we're doing is an adult survey. You can look at other surveys that have been done again by the government through the Department of Education, and you see a similar pattern. So getting back to this issue of, is it just a blip on, is it irrelevant? And I know you didn't say that, but is it kind of irrelevant? Like, what if society's great and everything's all right? Well, you see so many of these things through different relative, pretty legitimate federally, not everything in federal is necessarily legitimate, but I'm saying these sort of nationally representative surveys. And that's what, the Time Use Survey, the Department of Education surveys, and
they're all pointing in the same.
They're all pointing in the same direction, and they're tending to show that split between men and women, boys and girls. But again, that both of them declining, but with that split in terms of women reading more, girls reading more than men.
How important is it for parents to read to their children?
Oh, it's extremely important from what we know. And that's when you said predictor, I think that's another one.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. And I think the reading to children piece, if you look at that Time Use study, it was a very small percentage of parents who did that. And that was, I think, one of the things the authors of the study noted is they were concerned about the fact that so few adults, I don't have the percentage, but it was like in the single digits, very low, who said they read to their children.
Do we know that it's gone down? Because I know that anecdotally it feels like it's gone down. But I say this to a lot of parents and they say, who are these parents who've got time to read to their kids? No one ever read to me when I was a child.
Well, that's true.
Right?
So actually the study, this Time Use study didn't find a change in the share of people reading to their kids, but it was a low share to begin with.
Yeah.
So that's what they're
So it might be that it's always been low and we overrate it because we love reading to our kids, but actually it's having the books around and They do it at school. They'll find a way.
Right. And I think we can overplay the sort of social benefit or the sort of instrumental benefit of doing this stuff. I mean, it's another angle or piece to think about is sort of our artistic heritage, if you will, like just having access to the great things that have been done in the past. You could probably quote some really good philosophers on this, but I guess what I'm saying is, are we forfeiting access or precluding access to great ways of participating in the arts? I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is bolster and improve, give people more direct engagement with arts product, if you will.
And that was Adam Smith's justification for, he didn't call it the NEA.
Yeah.
But when he said the government should fund something like the NEA, he said it for he didn't think it would like improve society or be this wonderful, he thought education was instrumentally useful, but he basically said it was for the benefit of the citizens. And it would be good for them individually.
I think it's a very humane way to think about it.
What about the international comparison? Everything we've said has been about America. Are we an outlier in this country? Is it the same in Europe?
I do remember years ago, and again, I'm sorry I don't have this in the top of my head, but there is something called the PISA, which is an acronym for an international assessment of students across the country. I don't believe they look at propensity to read or, whether people read for fun, but they do look at reading scores. And if I remember, we were kind of in the middle of the pack, the U.S. was. I'll have to go back and look, but that's Department of Education, I think, used to be involved in that. But I do know that internationally, I know in the UK, they've been having similar issues with reading rates. It's been widely publicized. I haven't looked at too many other countries at this point. If
you could implement one new policy to get the number to go up, what would it be?
So I can't, as a mere government official right now, say what policy I would implement. That wouldn't be my place.
Does the research suggest what such a policy might beneficially?
I think it's really getting back to. I mean, it's not that difficult. I mean, it takes an infrastructure of support. Yeah. So you need to have.
There's no magic model.
There's no magic model, but you do need to have some basic supports, right? I mean, I think you need to have a community reading, like libraries, bookstores, book fairs. You need that kind of stuff. You need schools that value literature and ideally rich breadth of literature, reading of all types. You need to have places where kids can sneak away and read the sort of non-official books, You need to have all that kind of stuff. And of course, digitally, you need that access through digital media. And it is there. I mean, there's a lot of great places to go. It's just that, as we all know, you kind of need a guide. You need a Virgil or something to kind of take you through the internet, to show, especially young learners, where to go for this kind of material. And some schools are really good at, and a lot of educators are really good at directing them. But I'm just suggesting that at this early stages, especially given what we're seeing with the numbers, it probably behooves us not to close the door on digital reading, but definitely don't close the door on print reading at that stage, I would say.
Yeah. So if the takeaways are something like the younger they are, the more print they need.
According to some studies, yeah.
Yeah, no, this is all research-based. The younger they are, the more print they need. Social infrastructure is very important. Institutions are very important. But we should bear in mind that the research is not definitive about digital audiobooks, print, the whole balance. And we need to try and get the best of all of these aspects.
I think so. I think it's a more kind of thing. It's, in the arts, cultural researchers refer to the omnivore theory. That the idea that when people get hooked and get into one particular art form, a lot of times they'll hop around and they get engaged with some other art form because they've had the bug, And I think that's something we want in readers because it'll expose people to many, many more ideas and portals of imagination than just one route alone. I just think it's a question. But, as you said, there are also measurable outcomes that we've seen over time. We can't say it's causal, but in terms of those people who tend to read more also tend to seem to have certain in aggregate certain economic outcomes, civic outcomes, and social outcomes that are more favorable than those who don't. I mean, there's a lot that we still don't know, and I think it's really important that we don't be complacent.
Are we going to find it out, or are we just going to have to live with the mystery?
Well, I think surveys are getting better. We're hoping to redesign the survey, so maybe the next few years we'll have something better. The thing is, with government surveys, there's always a bit of a lag because we do the survey and then the data comes out. We have to process it and do the write-ups. Maybe AI will help. We don't know. And then at some point, the report comes out, and it's maybe a couple of years after the actual survey was conducted. I do think there's a lot of smart ways now people are getting data that are sort of more organic ways through, online transactions, through, all kinds of other means that I think would greatly enhance what we know about reading in the future. So I'm hopeful that we can tap into some of that stuff in the future.
And it's good to have the lag, right? Because everything is so driven by the current scare story, the current thing. And
that's true. Yeah, I think what's great about it, these surveys, even if I sometimes, critique our own work, or often do, it's large. These are large shares of the population, and it's truly nationally representative. I mean, they do everything they can to knock on the doors and get the right people into the sample frame. So that makes it, and the fact it's been done periodically or historically, there's a great trend line there. But I think we can never be complacent about it. And I think, it's great that you're asking about these questions because it suggests that maybe there's more people who care about this than just us lone social science researchers.
I think a lot of people care about the general question of the reading decline.
Yeah.
And they want more in-depth numbers. So
more information. Yeah, definitely.
Because it can look like we really know what's going on. But what I find interesting about this is, well, up to a point.
Right. And one of the things we are trying to get better at with these surveys is not only the people who read or receive stuff, but put stuff out into the world, right? So a lot of our work on creating art, we're now getting to things like, doing podcasts, doing just what all kinds of formats people engage with. And there's definitely some connection there. Interesting, I think the numbers of we in fact ask about writing creatively, and we get those numbers too. And and that I think has declined a little bit, but not so steeply.
You don't think people are switching from consuming art to creating it?
That's what I want to see, actually.
Yeah.
I want to see more of that. I think it's going to take some time as well as the actual changes to the survey.
Okay. Now, I can't let you go without bringing up the fact that as a child, you had a party trick, which was that you could date any book by its smell.
Apparently, yeah. So this is something, I was living in rural Mississippi at the time, and I don't know why, but we just moved there, and I guess maybe I was trying to be popular. I don't think this is something I'd recommend, but we were in the school libraries and stuff. I would just pick up a book, and I don't know how this started, but I used to get in the habit of, I'd find these books, and they're often very old, sitting on the shelves. Who would have read them, right, in a school library, and pick them up, and I would smell the pages, and in doing so, for some reason, I could usually date the book. So it got to be within a couple of years usually. And so I got pretty good at it. And so I didn't do this 24 hours, but it was something I would do as a sort of party trick in the school. And I remember once a teacher kind of getting irritated because I was making people laugh or doing something like that. And then that teacher got interested and was giving me books to look at and read.
The teacher had you sniff the books.
Yeah. And I would always get it within a year or two. And sometimes it would really start. And I don't know where that, I think this is something to do with, like a vintage or a fine wine. You could just tell what year it was brewed or whatever. So it was something like that. But I've long lost, I think I moved to reading them or
you've moved to reading the books.
Talking about them or doing studies about them rather than actually sniffing book glue.
Very good. Sunil Iyengar, this was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.
To find more episodes of The Street Porter and the Philosopher and the full transcript for this episode, check out our joint Substack, The Pursuit of Liberalism.
If you want to know more about each of our work, I've got a Substack and a podcast called The Common Reader, and Rebecca's got a Substack called The Ends Don't Justify the Means, and a podcast, Working Definition.
If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, @StreetPorterPhilosopher. Or you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast app is.
For now, take our guests' great advice and listen to some music, head to the museum, read a great book, and we'll see you next time.